Hello everyone, welcome to the next lesson of this online animal behavior course. Today we're going to be diving deep into understanding the proximate mechanisms of behavior. So in the last lesson, we focused mostly on two of Tinbergen's questions, namely the ultimate questions. We looked at why behaviors exist, what function or adaptive value they serve, as well as their evolutionary history or maybe like the timeline of the behavior. However, now we're going to shift to his proximate questions. As a reminder, we have two types of proximate questions. The first questions we are going to focus on are the mechanism questions, which are concerned with how a behavior functions or what causes the behavior to occur. These mechanisms can be hormonal, genetic, they can be neurologically based. There's a sort of a number of factors that we're going to be discussing over the next couple lessons. Now, if you remember from the last couple lessons, we talked about how maybe like the hormone testosterone can cause aggressive behavior, or maybe physical touch, which is just a stimuli, can cause the venous flytrap to close. These would be examples of mechanisms or proximate mechanisms that we can study through animal behavior. The second type of proximate questions are developmental questions. And these kinds of questions focus mostly on how behavior changes or develops throughout one's lifetime. However, for this lesson, we're going to focus on the mechanism questions. Next chapter, we'll discuss those other developmental questions. Now, we're going to be focusing on 5 main mechanisms in this class. We're not going to touch on all of them in this lesson, but we will get to all of them within time. The 5 that we're going to be focusing on are 1, genetic and molecular mechanisms. These mechanisms are when behavior is determined by genes or molecular pathways that then sort of set the potential for variation amongst behavioral traits. The second type are neural mechanisms. This is when behavior is controlled by brain circuits or nerve pathways. Third, we have sensory mechanisms. This is where specialized sensory systems will detect environmental stimuli, and then the detection of those stimuli will trigger behavioral responses. Fourth, and the last one we're going to talk about in terms of proximate mechanisms here, are hormonal mechanisms. And this is when chemical messengers like hormones will influence behavior by binding to receptors at different parts of the brain or different parts of the body. And then lastly are developmental mechanisms, which relate a lot more towards that second Tinbergen proximate question, the developmental question, which is when you have learned behaviors or sort of flexible behaviors, and we'll talk about those in the next chapter. So let's go ahead and dive in. But before we dive in too much, I do want us to remember that these proximate mechanisms are not like separate individual buckets. They all work together. For example, when a bird sings in the spring, its behavior is shaped by neural circuits that produce the song, but those circuits could be activated by hormones like testosterone, which themselves could be regulated by the bird's development. Specifically, like maybe it had to learn the song, or maybe it's in a breeding cycle. So all of these things can kind of work together to ultimately influence behavior. So any single behavior usually involves multiple proximate mechanisms interacting rather than one single one working in isolation. But we're going to sort of break down the study of these different mechanisms further. So the first one we're going to dive deep into is the genetic mechanisms. And so genes and molecular pathways can set the potential for variation amongst behavioral traits. This variation is tied to one's genotype. So in one of the previous lessons, we talked about the difference between genotype and phenotype. But basically, this mechanism says that there are some behaviors that are genetically programmed into individuals. And so one example is the hygienic versus the unhygienic bee. And so there are two different genotypes. The unhygienic bee is actually dominant, whereas the hygienic bee is a recessive trait. But the genotype, depending on what genotype the bee gets, it will either make very clean, nice, neat, and organized honeycombs, or they will be kind of partial, and halfway filled and a little bit more disorganized, or have some differences in the way that they make these honeycombs. And so this is an example of how a genetic mechanism can give rise to certain behavior based on an organism's genotype. So the first example we're going to dive really, really deep into is a case study on the Trinidadian guppies. And these guppies are a small little fish, and they live in different parts of a cascading waterfall. So if you see here, you can kind of see how there's different pools, right? And they go down, they lead into one another. And within each one of these pools is an individual subpopulation of a species of fish. So at the higher up in the waterfall, there are less predators. And whereas as you get closer and closer to the bottom, there are more and more predators. At the very, very bottom, where there's no more waterfalls, is where the highest predation risk exists. And so this has sort of led to differences in the population. Even though they're very similar species, they are very different in the way that they look. For example, the Trinidadian guppies that are higher up in the waterfall have a lot more bright coloration. They have a very high reproductive age, which means they have to be older in order to reproduce. And they also usually have fewer but larger offspring. In contrast, the guppies that live towards the bottom of the waterfall and have a lot more predation risk, they don't have any coloration. They actually reproduce at a much younger age, and they have a lot more numerous but smaller offspring. And so I beg you to sort of think back to our evolution lesson and think about why might these traits be existing in these different subpopulations of the Trinidadian guppies. And so give you a second to think about that for a second. Yeah, so hopefully what you came to was that the selective pressures in the different habitats led natural selection to select different traits. And you could probably go through and explain why these would be advantageous in a high predator area versus a low predator area, and kind of look at those. But the interesting thing is, it's not just physical traits that the guppies have differences in. There are also behavioral differences. For example, the guppies that live in a low population area have typically smaller schools, and they're, importantly for an experiment that we're going to go over, they're much more bold when it comes to inspecting new things. Compared to the guppies that live downstream, they form much larger schools. Once again, that makes sense, right? The larger the school, the bigger you appear to a predator, the less likely you're to be predated, right? It's strength in numbers. But they also are way more cautious when it comes to inspecting predators, and they often do so more frequently, but they make sure they keep their distance. And so if you were to design an experiment to determine what these behavioral differences are, how would you design it? Do we want to know if it's genetic, if it's learned? Like, how are these guppies behaving differently? Why are they behaving differently? So give yourself to think about how you would design an experiment. That's a big part of animal behavior is getting a question and then trying to design an experiment. So give yourself a second to think about that. If you need to, go ahead and pause the video. But yeah, so what we're going to do now is I'm actually going to go over an experiment that was conducted with this species. So what they did is they took a net and they captured these species and they brought them into a lab where they had no predators, they had abundant resources, and they were able to live in a very safe aquarium where they did not have any predators. They then let them live and reproduce for many, many generations, and then they measured their offspring's behavior. And what they found was that even after many generations, the offspring and the descendants of the downstream guppies were consistently more shy and less bold than the upstream colorful guppies. And so if behavior was learned, we would have expected that both groups should be about the same, since they've all grown up in an area that no longer had predators. And so the main key takeaway of that is that behavior can indeed be genetic instead of learned. And so it turns out that this shyness, boldness behavior is actually a genetically inherited trait that persists in the population. So this brings up the age-old debate about whether our behavior is more the result of nature, like our genetics, or nurture, like our environment. The previous experiment would suggest that nature plays an important role, and maybe perhaps a more important role than nurture. But today we know that it's a combination of both. Yes, genetics sometimes prevail, and for other species with other behaviors, the environment can sometimes be more important. But it's our job as animal behavior researchers to uncover what's going on. This is the point of these proximate mechanism questions. So let's look at a more complex example that goes beyond the Trinidadian guppy example. So if you look at seagulls, we've all probably seen seagulls at some point in our lives, whether at the beach or in the Walmart parking lot. Seagulls are an abundant species in the United States. And so if you watch a seagull chick, which you can see here pictured, they're quite large, but they have different coloration. Seagull chicks, when they go and they need to be fed by their mom, they will walk up and do this begging behavior where they open their mouth and they turn their head. And so it turns out that there is some variation in some of this behavior. So the moms will only feed seagulls chicks when they beg, and then there's variation in how the begging happens. And so the question is this begging a genetically pre-programmed behavior because it happens at such a young age, or is it learned? Now, if it was the nature prevailing, then we would think that chicks are genetically programmed to beg, and some are just weak and they're bad at begging because of, maybe they just don't have the nutrition to be able to do the things that they're genetically pre-programmed to do. And that is what's leading to this variation in begging behavior. But the nurture answer would suggest that chicks do learn how to beg over time, and that begging improves as they learn. And so that some chicks are just bad at begging because they have not been able to learn, whereas other chicks are much better because they've had more experience. And so as animal behaviorists, we can try to answer this question. So what they did was they took two groups of chicks. For one control chick, they let them be raised as normal by their mother. Those can be seen with the wild, right? The wild group on the left side of the graph, and the other group were hand reared by humans, and you can see them on sort of the right side of the graph. And what they did is they then measured the number of times that they either begged or turned their head. And this is because it's sort of the two part of the behavior. The begging is the opening of the mouth, and the turning is so that it makes it easier for the mom to feed the chick. And so if you look at this graph, one of the big parts about animal behavior is looking at results and being able to interpret what those results mean. And so let's look at this graph, and I'll give you a second to kind of think about what the conclusion of this graph might be. We see that the wild group, they were both turning their head a lot, as well as begging a lot, whereas the hand-reared chicks would beg, but they wouldn't really turn their head. And so if you need to think about it, go ahead and pause the video. But ultimately, the conclusion here is that begging is a genetically pre-programmed behavior, but the turning of the head, which helps the mother to feed the chick better, is a learned behavior. The chicks that were hand-reared and unable to learn from their mother or maybe from other chicks do not do the head-turning behavior. And so nurture is also very important. There are certainly behaviors that are genetically pre-programmed to behave and to be performed in a certain way, but nurture plays a significant role as well. So I'm going to highlight this experiment. This is a really, really important experiment that shows you how nurture can come to play a role in animal behavior. And so scientists, what they did is they bred two breeds of mice through artificial selection. They allowed certain mice that were really good at running mazes to breed together, And if they were ever an offspring that was bad at the maze, then they got put in this other group, and they could only breed with other mice that were dumb or bad at running the maze, right? And so eventually, over generations, you get two different strains of mice. You got mice that can run mazes and mice that are really bad at mazes, right? And then what they did is they took a final generation, and they said, okay, we're going to change the environment. We know that there are bad mice and there are good mice, right, at mazes. But we can change the environment from when they're born to see if that alters their ability to run the maze. And then what they did is they put these different groups of mice into different environments, and then when they got older, they had them run the maze and measure the number of mistakes that they made. So if you see the yellow bars, those represent the maze smart mice, and the blue bars represent the maze dumb mice, the mice that make a lot of mistakes when they run mazes. And you see, let's look at the control condition first. You see at control, when they're raised in a normal environment, you see that the maze smart mice make significantly less errors or mistakes than the maze dumb mice. But if you look at it, you can manipulate their environment to change their behavior, right? So if you raise a mice, both smart or dumb mice, in a restricted environment with no enrichment, no toys, a very boring, very dull environment, they make a lot of mistakes, both of them. Even the maze smart mice make a lot of mistakes. But interestingly, an enriched environment can also do the opposite. So if you take mice that are a part of the maze dumb strand, and you put them in an environment where they can succeed and grow and have an enriched environment with lots of environmental enrichment and toys, you can see that even though their parents and their genetic pre-programmed disposition for being bad at mazes means they should make a lot of mistakes, they actually have a significant reduction in the number of mistakes they make. And so ultimately, this shows that behavior does also get influenced by one's environment, and it is not solely genetics. It's a combination of both nature and nurture. And so now we're going to move on to the next mechanism. So when we talk about neural mechanisms, we're really asking, how does the nervous system generate behaviors? At one level, this can be a simple reflex. For example, many fish have these giant neurons that are called mouth nerve cells, and they trigger this instant escape response if there's like sort of a sudden vibration in the water. And so that's an example of a neural mechanism. Their escape behavior is caused by this neural circuit. Now, at another level, though, neural mechanisms control much more complex behaviors. For example, songbirds have this specialized brain region called the HVC. You don't need to remember that, but it's a special brain area that controls learning and produces song. And importantly, these neural circuits aren't fixed. They can actually change through learning and memory, but it's still a neural mechanism that can give rise to the bird's song. So neural activity provides the immediate moment-to-moment control of behavior. It's sort of the wiring and the rewiring and the firing that sort of turns these sensory inputs into actions. Now here's a classic example, and it's kind of a funny one when you think about it, but it's a classic example that shows how neural circuits can change and control behavior. And so what they did is they found, first they started with an observation. If you have a locust and you pull out the surface that the locust is standing on, it will immediately engage in flight behavior. It's almost an automatic response. And so the question is, why or how? And so what they did is they ran an experiment where they started removing certain body parts of the locust and then removing the surface from beneath the locust and seeing if the locust still tried to fly. And so what they first did is they removed the head. They removed the locust's brain and removed the surface, and what do you know? Even though they don't have a brain controlling their entire body, the locust without a head still jumped, took off, and flapped its wings and flew. And so it's kind of a bit of a morbid experiment, but still it shows that it's not the brain that's controlling this behavior, it's something else. And so let's go ahead and remove another body part. And so this time, instead of removing the head, they instead removed the wings. And then they once again removed the surface from underneath the locust. And then what do you know? The locust still jumped up and tried to flap its wings, but obviously its wings were not there. And so the locust just sort of fell to the ground. And so this is where they were like, we wonder what it is. And so after more and more experimentation, they found that there's actually what is known as a central pattern generator, right? And so this central pattern generator is a complex circuit of neurons that can basically produce rhythmic motor outputs, like in this case, wing flapping. And it doesn't need any access to the brain whatsoever. In locust, this circuit actually connects a sensory input that's located inside of the locust's feet to motor neurons that then drive the muscles to flap the wings. And so when the locust's feet lose contact with the ground, the circuit automatically activates the wing muscles in a flight rhythm. Even if the brain's gone, even if the wings are gone, it will still activate the flight muscles. And so this is sort of a beautiful demonstration of how neural mechanisms, not just brain, high-level brain control, can generate behavior. And so I really like this example. It's kind of a bit morbid, and so I do apologize, but it is really interesting to show that some things can happen like reflexes even without having access to the brain. And this kind of brings up what we're going to call fixed action patterns. Fixed action patterns are a really, really important part of animal behavior. And so I really, really want you guys to kind of understand this. Fixed action patterns are behaviors that have three characteristics. If a behavior does not have one of these characteristics, then it is not a fixed action pattern. And so you definitely need to be able to discriminate between fixed action patterns and not fixed action patterns. So the three characteristics are this. One, the movement or behavior always needs to be performed in the same way every time. It's called stereotyped. The second one is that the behavior needs to go until completion, and it is very, very hard for the behavior to stop. And the third one is it needs to be triggered by a stimulus. And so the stimulus can be anything. It can be light, it can be physical touch, it can be any sort of stimulus, but it needs to be triggered by a stimulus. And so if the behavior just happens not from a stimulus, then it's not a fixed action pattern. And so we're going to go over these a little bit more. I'm going to give you some examples to practice whether it is a fixed action pattern or not. So here is an example. Sorry that my video is a little bit in the way here, but I'm going to go ahead and read this example, and I want you to think about those three characteristics and whether this behavior possesses all three of those characteristics. So in a species of small forest bird, researchers observed that when a sudden shadow passes overhead, the birds perform a quick alarm call and hop to cover. Now, most individuals follow a similar sequence of hops and wing flicks, and the alarm call is always present. However, sometimes birds pause mid-hop if they detect a second shadow, and the exact number of hops or the path to cover varies slightly depending on the nearby obstacles or even the presence of other birds. And so I'll pause for a quick second and ask, is this an example of a fixed action pattern? The answer is no. So in a species, we do have a stimulus, right? So step one, we need to make sure there's a stimulus triggering the behavior. And the stimulus is a shadow passing overhead, right? So that's stimulus. We got that. That's check. And then the birds need to perform this behavior the same way every single time they do that. And related, it needs to go until completion. Now, there are two pieces of evidence in this description here that suggest that these are not qualified as doing the same. So first, they don't do the same number of hops, the path can vary, and it's not a stereotyped behavior. So that's automatically number one gone. Even if you have the other two, that's still not a fixed action pattern. But even then, it doesn't really go until completion either, because birds can often pause mid-hop, which would suggest that they are able to stop this fixed action pattern. Now, I will say this is not a black and white on this one, because there are instances where an animal could be doing a fixed action pattern and you can physically restrain them from being able to do it, in which case they will stop. But in normal circumstances, right, they're not going to just stop because of a simple shadow passing overhead, right? A fixed action pattern will go until completion unless there is some external force that's acting upon the animal. And so let's go over another example. So researchers observed that when a gray-lag goose notices an egg outside the nest, It extends its neck, places the underside of its bill against the egg, and uses a series of sweeping motions to roll the egg back into the nest. Now, interestingly, once the movement begins, the goose will continue the full sequence from where the egg was all the way back to the nest. Sometimes even rolling an invisible egg if you were to kick the egg out from underneath of it while it's doing this behavior. It'll still keep going as if the egg is there. Now, the same response can also be triggered not only by real eggs, but also by objects that kind of look like eggs, like golf balls or ping pong balls. And so you can leave a white golf ball outside of a gray-lag goose nest, and it will actually treat it as an egg, and it will go perform this behavior. This is a real-life example. And so my question is this a fixed action pattern? So go ahead and, if you need to pause, go ahead and pause the video and think about it. The answer is yes. The reason it's yes is because, one, it's triggered by a stimulus, right? And so the stimulus are white, round objects located outside of the nest. And so that is the stimulus. Check for that. The second thing is, does it go until completion? The answer is yes. Remember, even if you kick the egg out from underneath the goose, it will still continue the motion until it returns to the nest. So that's step 2. That's also a check. And then step 3, is it always performed the same way? We can see through the description of it saying that through a series of sweeping motions, it rolls the egg back into the nest, right? And it doesn't anywhere in this example highlight differences in how that's done. Some of them don't use their feet. Some of them use their bills. They all do it in a very, very similar way. And so it is a stereotyped behavior. So this would be a great example of a fixed action pattern. If you really want to see an awesome example of different fixed action patterns and how one fixed action pattern can actually result in a cascading event of other fixed action patterns between two individuals, I really, really highly recommend you go watch this video. It's linked into the PowerPoint notes, but it talks about sort of the three-spine stickleback fixed action pattern and how the males will do this sort of dance when they see the stimuli of a female and lead them to their nest. And it's a really, really great video, so I highly recommend you watch it. So go ahead and just go ahead and watch it, and then go to the next slide whenever you're ready. Awesome. So I really like that video because it highlights actually two fixed action patterns within the same species, one performed by the males and one performed by the females. And so the fixed action pattern in the case of the males is that when they see the female stimuli, so they see the stimuli that triggers its fixed action pattern as a female, it then performs this very stereotyped zigzag dance and swims its way back to the nest, where it then kind of highlights and triggers the fixed action pattern of the female. And what the female does is when it sees the stimuli of the male swimming towards the nest, it will then engage in that behavior where it nestles into the nest and then lays the eggs, right? And then there's probably sort of a series of fixed action patterns where the male will then stimulate the muscles of the female, causing her to release the eggs. And then the male, through a fixed action pattern of his own, when he sees that the female has laid eggs in his nest, he will then go into the nest, fertilize them, and perform a second or third or fourth fixed action pattern. At this point, I don't know which it is in the chain. But basically, this is sort of a behavior that is all the result of fixed action patterns. Stimulus followed by stereotyped behavior till completion, followed by stimulus, and so it creates this sort of chain. And so that's a really famous example, but it's also one that I think is really cool and interesting. And so yeah, this is going to be where I wrap up for this lesson. Just a couple overview parts of this talk. We talked about the proximate mechanisms, but specifically genetic mechanisms and neural mechanisms. We talked about the idea versus nature versus nurture and which is more important. The idea is that they're actually both quite important. And then we really discussed and went deep into fixed action patterns. And so I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson. I look forward to the next one, and I hope that this was helpful.